This is the third of our mini lectures on the topic of Lacan's mirror stage. I've given it two titles. The first of those is Ego as Virtual Construction, and then the subtitle that I came up with when I was delineating the various themes and topics that I thought we needed to cover was From Mirage to Alienation. So we'll speak to both of those ideas. I'm going to start with, as I often do, with a little anecdote. And this is something that happened a couple of months ago. A student approached me and said, I'm very interested in virtual reality. I want to do some research into virtual reality, and I'm also interested in Lacan and psychoanalysis. So how do those two connect? So my response was, well, yeah, virtual reality is the ego state of being, in a sense. Go read the mirror stage. And I suppose what I'm going to try and do today is try and explore a little bit why I would have made that suggestion. And also to try and say a little bit about why, in fact, the ego itself, in other words, your sense of being a self, the sense of who you are, the sense of an I, why in many respects one can say that that is itself a virtual construction, a virtual object. So let's turn to the first of our ideas here. We've been exploring how the image in its various forms becomes the basis of an identification, an imaginary identification, which in turn becomes the basis of an I and an I functioning. Now, there's many things that are enabled when that operation starts to take place, but there's also some issues that arise from that situation. One of those issues is the fact that if I take as the basis of my subjectivity, the basis of my sense of self, the basis of my ego, an image that by definition is outside me, that comes from the outside, then we have this rather odd logical contradiction that my image, in a sense, is more I than I am. The image is more original than I am myself, simply because it's something that I've had to take from outside of myself to make myself with. So we have a kind of contradiction where other is I and I is other. Or put slightly differently again, where the other seems somehow more originary than me if the other is the mirror image. And bear in mind, part of what we've been trying to argue is that my mirror image is not necessarily only in the most direct and concrete literal sense as my mirror image. Other people can function as my image. So if other people are functioning in part as my image, if I'm seeing myself in others, I'm trying to get others to receive images of me, to recognize me, and I'm constantly seeing myself in others and trying to get a response of recognition from others, you could say that there's a kind of confusion at the very basis that underlies an ego. This takes us to this notion of transitivism. Early Lacan is not worried about borrowing from psychology and does so many times. The notion of transitivism is, I'll give you my gloss on the concept, is as experience when you could say there's a kind of overextension of the boundaries of the ego. So the classic example, kind mundane, quite simple, is the idea that if two little children are together in the playground, one child can fall down and start crying, can be in pain, and the child who's just witnessed the event, who's right close to that child, might start crying as well, almost as if they are experiencing the event that has happened to someone else. Again, it's almost as if they have cast the boundaries of their ego too widely, that there's been an overextension of their ego. So what happens to someone else feels like it's happening to me as well. Now, of course, sometimes people say, well, we can just dismiss that because that's kind of infantile behavior, the patterns of identification we see in children. Maybe you could try and argue that, but you could also argue that there's many other examples. For me at least, is if you watch a film and someone is receiving an injection, sometimes you have a kind of flinch reaction to that. It's almost, again, as if there's been an overextension of the boundaries, of the parameters of my ego. Now, if that's true, and if it is also the case that, as I've just mentioned, I use other people as an image resource to try and understand myself, then you could say that the basic condition of possibility for an ego is always to be reliant on others, on other egos, to try and form and substantiate an image of oneself. which then means one's ego is always, in a sense, derivative of the images and the other people around one. This then means you could say that we have a constant state of ego entanglements, where I see more of myself or what I imagine to be myself in others, where I'm reliant on others for an image of myself. So in my very bad sketch down here, obviously this is just a simplification and a silly way of trying to illustrate the point, but I think the point comes through. You could say that what we think an ego looks like is some kind of singular subjectivity, just a person, just a single individual. But for Lacan, an ego is never going to look simply like that. It's always going to look like at least two figures superimposed. Because an ego is always reliant on an image. It's always reliant on others to gain a substantiating image identification for itself. So the basic condition of possibility for an ego identification, you could say, is that it's always in a state of entanglement with others, with other mirror images, with other people that give it sense of coherence. So the basic unit of analysis when we're trying to think about individual psychology is not going to be that for Lacan. It's always going to be something like that. And just to make that point even more strongly, that means that the image is more originary than the ego itself. We're always, in a sense, reliant upon, dependent upon those others who give us an image of ourselves. So that's what we should bear in mind. That, in a way, for Lacan, is the primary unit of analysis, if we want to use those terms when we're thinking about an ego in its entanglement with others. When he makes this point, when he stresses this, it reminds me a little bit of what Freud has to say about the narcissism of minor differences. And here's another little anecdote. Prior to getting married, I went off to this big meeting, this kind of religious church thing, saying, well, look, what do you need to think about before you get married? So I'm there with my fiance, we're doing this whole thing, and then someone comes up and says, oh, hi, my name's so-and-so, you're Derek. Oh, you're from South Africa, aren't you? And he looks around, this is all happening in London. Oh, there's another South African in the room, why don't you meet him? And what then follows is this kind of uncomfortable, weird situation where we're the two South Africans in the room. We're like, yeah, pleased to meet you. And of course, as soon as we've been introduced to one another, we both go to separate corners of the room. What's the relevance of all of that? You could say that for both of us, that was our thing. That was our image. That was our uniqueness in that situation, to be the one South African in the place. So we don't really want to be introduced to the other South African because that compromises the one singular, unique element of what makes me, me. Now, if we bear in mind what I've just said, we start to get a sense then of both how I'm reliant upon my image, but also I can have some kind of antagonistic, rivalrous relationship with the person, with the mirror image, because they seem to threaten my sense of being unique. And as we've arrived at that point, we're getting a sense then both of how desperately reliant I am upon my image, that I love my image. There's a jubilant assumption because it is the thing that defends against the anxiety of me falling apart. So there's a great deal of love, of narcissistic love and jubilation. And I love those pictures of myself where I'm looking good, when it's a good hair day. But of course, there's also antagonism when one confronts an image which seems, or a person, which seems to threaten my own original sense of myself. And that discordant relationship with an image is really something that we need to explore a little bit. Let us jump ahead here quickly to this notion, point number 3, libidinal ambivalence, or as I put it, why the brothers Grimm read Lacan. What's the point here? The point is simply to say, we've all seen this scene. We've all been exposed to, mirror, mirror, on the wall, who is the fairest of us all? Okay, so this is my obvious bad enactment of the wicked queen in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of us all? Now, some days, when it's a good day, the mirror goes, oh, queen, it is you. You're the most fair. You're the most beautiful in all the land. This is a moment when the mirror is returning an affirming ego image, an idealizing, ideal ego image, which means that the queen has her little narcissistic rush of happiness. She's affirmed by an image, or the voice of the image in this respect, and she feels fantastic. But as we all know, it doesn't always go like that. There comes a day when she does the whole thing, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of us all? And the mirror goes, bad news, it's not you, it's someone else. And of course, the rivalry and the aggressive impulse, the hostility, in fact, the murderous desire that flows from that situation is because, in Lacanian terms at least, the queen's had her image, her specialness, her uniqueness threatened by another, and hence that other must die. But of course, you've probably anticipated then that we have a bit of a logical conundrum here. The image is at the same time both the thing which affirms us that we love and that gives us our narcissistic high, which gives us a sense of substantiality, an ego, a sense of our uniqueness. But at the same time, it is the thing that we can be murderously, aggressively hostile towards. And if you wanted to think about a very pedestrian, silly example of that, just think about when you take a whole bunch of photographs that include you, particularly photographs, selfies, whatever. You're very quick to treasure the ones where you look good, but you're very quick also to delete and get rid of the ones that you dislike. So that's the kind of libidinal ambivalence, the problem of both loving and hating the images, because those images are both either sustaining a sense of one's ego, or they seem to be threatening. They seem to be taking it apart. But importantly, this situation is not ultimately something that's finally resolved. Those crossing lines of libidinal aggression and libidinal loving investment retain their place. They're always there. There's no easy reconciling of this. We have that double valence in how we relate to our images. Okay, then, let's just quickly make a point about this. Point number 4, the ego can be characterized by a defensive anticipatory temporality. We've said a little bit about this, but here is the time in the lecture when I give you your Lacan quote of the day. And we're going back to the mirror stage essay. And Lacan has this to say about the processes of the mirror stage, the processes of this imaginary identification with an image. This form, he says, situates the agency known as the ego, he's talking about the mirror stage process. This form situates the agency known as the ego in a fictional direction that will forever remain irreducible. In other words, the reliance one has on an image to substantiate oneself, that reliance continues, which means that we're fundamentally reliant on an image, which is something which is outside of us, which means that presumably we'll always be by definition alienated if what we take is the very basis of our most intimate personal sense of subjectivity and self comes from the outside. I like the mention of the fictional direction there, because it seems to suggest that we're vulnerable, more than vulnerable, that we're hungry for images to sustain ourselves. And we will take images, sometimes more idealized, presumably, than need be, we'll take idealized images to give us a sense of ourselves that will hold us together. In other words, there's no necessary factuality or objectivity underlying the ego. And in this respect, Lacan is streets apart, very, very different to some of the ideas that ego psychology might make. Ego psychology being a form of psychoanalysis that starts to emerge after the Second World War in the United States. And there are moments in ego psychology, and I don't want to simply jettison or deny the contributions of ego psychology, but it seems to me that there's moments in ego psychology where the ego is treated as an agency of reality or something objective, as a kind of benchmark of a certain type of reality, of reliable, objective reality. Lacan is completely opposed to that. The ego takes its nature precisely by this fictional direction of finding whatever images will sustain it, whatever images will allow it to present itself and understand itself in an idealized way. And if that's the case, it's not something that can simply be relied upon. Let's also just note this anticipatory temporality. It's a fact I've noted a couple of times before, but the idea here is that in the desperation to take an image to give me the closure, the coherence, the integration of subjectivity that I so yearn for, you could argue, that in that moment I am so willing to grab onto something that I will grab onto something that's not necessarily the most accurate, if you could even say that, the most accurate or objective way of underlying my experiences, but it's also the case that we're always reaching towards the future. Now, by the time Lacan has started to write and publish this final version of the mirror stage, Martin Heidegger has already published Being in Time. And Being in Time, long philosophical text, which wants to stress that time and temporality is a very crucial part of what it means to be human. He's also very keen to emphasize, Heidegger, that we're moving towards the future, that there's a kind of temporality of the future which is distinctive, which is somehow characterizing of what it means to be human. I think that Lacan is also making his contribution to this forward-reaching temporality here, and this theme of an anticipatory temporality is important for him, but it links nicely to the notion of some kind of fictitious ego, because in reaching forward, in anticipating and having an identity built out of anticipations of what I might be, you could say that the ego is fundamentally always a virtual thing. My colleague Bruce Fink uses a nice example in his book Lacan on Love when he's trying to describe this anticipatory temporality of the ego. He uses the example of the unification of Germany. And he says there was lots of talk, lots of political moves to bring the former East and West Germany together, and people were thinking and understanding what Germany might be before it ever came together. And that anticipation and this almost illusory or imaginary need to build an identity on something that hasn't yet, as it were, been substantiated or may never ever fully be substantiated is a nice way of thinking this idea of an anticipatory temporality. Now, we've got a couple more points to make, but I think we've said quite a lot today. So I'm going to come back to these. Let's just maybe end here then on those 2 points. Having stressed this fictional direction, having stressed this idea of anticipatory temporality, I think we've said enough to be able to say why the ego itself is virtual in its nature, that it's a kind of virtual construction which enables me to do things. Let's just add 2 more points to that and qualify the points that I've made here. You could say that the ego is an image, it's a mirage, it's a kind of illusion which holds us together. Now, this doesn't mean it's completely disconnected from all of my experiences, presumably not. So to say it's a mirage doesn't mean that it's just completely, absolutely fictitious. It connects to bodily experiences. And of course, we remember Freud saying the ego is first and foremost a bodily ego, okay? So it's still connected to sensory perceptions and so on and so forth. But the important Lacanian point is that one's body and one's image of one's body is never exactly the same thing. Those things may harmonize, they may seem to come together in certain moments when I'm feeling fantastic and I find an image which seems to map to my hopes and aspirations for what my body might be. Another way of thinking about narcissism. But there's always going to be a minimal gap between how I have mapped my body, my imaginary sense of my body, and the domain of my physiological experience. We could think of many different examples of that situation. I can give you a silly one and a serious one. We can imagine the horrible situation when you go and you look in the mirror and you find like, oh, what is this? This is a liver spot, or there's some evidence of some kind of something going wrong in my body. And I assume this in an almost traumatized way because I have an image of myself which is one of life, that is one of living, which is one of some viable, ongoing sustainability to live longer. But when I find these symptoms somewhere in my body, that's a kind of traumatic realization. It's not just saying, oh, okay, this is what my body is doing. There's some kind of resistance against that. My own slightly silly example of that was some years ago, I said, oh, it's very sunny today, need to put on some sunblock because I'm going outside. So put on sunblock, I think I'm all very well prepared. I go out, do some gardening, whatever, come back into the house, look in the mirror, and I see over here, I've sunburnt myself over there. And of course, my own image of myself is that I'm not losing hair that much, that I've still got hair. And of course, I realized that actually my image and my physical bodily reality don't always match up. So just to make that point, there's always a kind of discrepancy. In certain instances of psychopathology, you could say that discrepancy is exaggerated and exacerbated. 2 examples that immediately come to mind is if we think about anorexia. In anorexia, you could say that the relationship between one's body and what one wants one's body to be and the mirror image that one has of one's body, those two things never match up. Those two things are a domain of conflict. And you could say that for most of us in the general domain of neurosis, we always have a minimally conflictual relationship with our body. It never quite looks like we want it to. Or if it does, it seems to only very fleetingly. Anyways, that point I think we've made. Body and body image don't map completely on one another. There's always an element of disjunction, an element of contradiction. And you could say the same holds between one's self-experience and the image, the imaginary, ego, idealized image that one has of oneself doesn't necessarily map onto the domain of subjective bodily experience. Those two things don't fit together. So what we're going to do then is just by conclusion make one last point, and then we'll return to explore some more of these facets of the mirror stage and imaginary identification. One sometimes gets this sense of frustration, but like my ego, Derek, you're telling me is somehow illusory. It's like smoke and mirrors. It's a mirage. Like, why should that be? There's also all this sense in Lacan that the mirror stage, the image is somehow a decoy or somehow fraudulent. But why should that necessarily be? One way that I think is quite helpful to try and illustrate that point, Lacan often refers to this form as we've seen. He speaks about this gestalt, which symbolizes the eye's mental permanence, at the same time as it prefigures its alienating destination. If we think about the operation of this ego as something like a gestalt, then we get a good sense of how it can be at the same time kind of illusory, but give us a sense of cohesion, of closure, of integration. And the best, very simple way of making that point is just to ask, what's this? What's happening here? What is that? Many, many times I've used this in class and I ask that and someone invariably says, it's a circle. And I go, well, no, it's not really a circle. It's a whole bunch of badly scribbled red marks on a whiteboard. Of course, obviously, one's eye sees it and closes that form off and performs that gestalt operation of turning a rudimentary stimulus into a form. And Lacan's argument would be to say that the ego does the same thing, or let's say the operation of the ego. It does the same thing. It takes a series of fragmented experiences and moments and gives them that form, that closure. That's also why I've said that we can think about the operations of the ego, which are crucially enabled via what he calls the mirror stage, as those of a closure machine. They give us a sense of substantiality. They give us a sense of coherence. They give us a sense of integration that we wouldn't otherwise have.